Martin Van Buren, the 8th President of the United States, was the earliest to run for a non-consecutive term. After losing re-election in 1840, he made attempts at the presidency in 1844 and 1848. In 1844, Democrats actually expected Van Buren to be their candidate. However, he lost favor with the powerful southern wing of the party because of his opposition to the annexation of Texas. They nominated dark horse James K. Polk instead, and Polk won the general election. Then, 4 years later, in 1848, Van Buren made it to the general election, not as a Democrat, but as the nominee of the Free Soil Party. There was virtually no way he could win. Rather, his goal was to spite the pro-slavery-dominated Democratic Party and throw the election to the Whigs. He didn't receive any electoral votes, but did receive 10% of the popular vote. And in the end, Whig candidate Zachary Taylor won the election. 13th President Millard Fillmore had also tried for a non-consecutive second term, though not as aggressively. Fillmore had never sought the presidency in the first place. He only took office after Zachary Taylor's death. Though he ran for his party's nomination in the next election, it was with a self-professed lack of desire, and he ultimately lost the nomination to Winfield Scott, and Scott went on to lose the general election. 4 years later, however, Fillmore was nominated as the candidate for the Know Nothing Party. He hadn't actively sought the nomination and was out of the country at the time he was nominated, yet he accepted it. In a three-way race, he came in third, but did capture 21% of the popular vote. In the 1860 election, former presidents John Tyler and Franklin Pierce considered running. This would have been quite a leap for Tyler, whose term ended in 1845. However, neither took the idea very far. With Van Buren, Tyler, Fillmore, and Pierce, that's 4 presidents in the span of about 2 decades who at least considered running for non-consecutive terms. Prior to Van Buren, no presidents had run for non-consecutive terms, probably because most succeeded in getting a consecutive second term. Starting with Van Buren, there was a long string of presidents who only served a single or a partial term, so a second term was always a possibility. In contrast, 18th President Ulysses S. Grant sought a non-consecutive third term. He originally declined to seek a third term after serving his 2. He wanted to respect the 2-term tradition and was sick of the presidency. However, by 1880, he'd been convinced by powerful figures in the Republican Party that he could easily win a third term. While early on he looked destined to be the candidate, intense factional divides prevented him from receiving the nomination. Ultimately, the 2 major factions in the Republican Party settled on dark horse James A. Garfield, who went on to win the general election. Democrat Grover Cleveland was the only president who was successful in receiving a non-consecutive second term, which is why he has the title 22nd and 24th President. He'd won the election of 1884 against Republican James Blaine, but then lost in 1888 to Benjamin Harrison. While leaving the White House, Cleveland's wife, Frances, reportedly told a staffer, quote, "I want you to take good care of all of the furniture and ornaments in the house, for I want to find everything just as it is now when we come back again. We are coming back 4 years from today." In contrast with his wife's sentiments, Cleveland was initially content with returning to his law practice and retiring from politics. However, by 1890, he'd changed his mind. He was annoyed by the blunders of the Harrison administration and was concerned that if he didn't step up, the Democrats would nominate his longtime rival David Hill, who Cleveland considered corrupt. It might be expected that a rematch between an incumbent and a former incumbent would be an especially vicious campaign, but this wasn't the case. By October, Harrison's wife was dying of tuberculosis, thus the candidate ceased all campaigning. Also, Benjamin Harrison, who would later compare leaving office to leaving prison, hardly desired a second term. Cleveland won the popular vote in all three elections, even the election of 1888, which he lost. Theodore Roosevelt stepped down at the end of his second term, endorsing William Howard Taft as his successor. However, Roosevelt ended up disappointed in Taft's presidency and decided to run for a third term of his own. The Republicans endorsed Taft instead, so like Van Buren, Roosevelt decided to run on a third-party ticket, the Bull Moose or Progressive Party. The split between Taft and Roosevelt doomed them both. However, Roosevelt received 27% of the popular vote and 88 electoral votes, the best showing of any third-party candidate. Many also believe that if Taft weren't in the race, Roosevelt would have easily defeated Woodrow Wilson and achieved a third term. Herbert Hoover left office as one of the most hated outgoing presidents in the nation's history, as he was blamed for the Great Depression. His loss to Franklin Roosevelt in 1932 was a landslide. This didn't stop him from seeking the Republican nomination, not once more, but twice, in the subsequent elections of 1936 and 1940. Because of Hoover's massive unpopularity, many Republicans declined to even associate with him. He didn't come close to being the nominee in either election, and the eventual candidates, Alf Landon and Wendell Willkie, lost in landslides anyways. Gerald Ford lost to Democrat Jimmy Carter in 1976 and never sought his party's nomination again. However, in 1980, there was a potential of him serving as Ronald Reagan's running mate. Nothing much ever came of it, but it was briefly possible that Ford could have returned to the White House, though in a different role. And most recently is Donald Trump. Ever since leaving office in 2021, Donald Trump has been determined to reclaim the presidency. If renominated by his party, it would be the first time since Theodore Roosevelt's 1912 run that one of the major candidates in the presidential election was a former president. The first time in over 100 years. To support this channel, consider subscribing and donating on Patreon. Donations from $2 to $15 a month help towards more frequent uploads. Patreon link in the description below.